This is Dr. Josh Kunith, and I welcome you to the GAF podcast, where I discuss grading, assessment, and feedback in secondary schools. This is podcast episode number 1, and I will be discussing distance learning recommendations for grading, assessment, and feedback. So before we get started, let me say just a little bit about myself. As I mentioned, I am Dr. Josh Kunith, and I am a veteran English teacher and department chair at Highland High School in Bakersfield, California. This is my 12th year teaching. I also write and research on areas of grading, assessment, and feedback, and this is something that I'm very passionate about. So we find ourselves, of course, in a very difficult situation right now. Today is April 10th, 2020, and schools have been closed for a matter of weeks right now, and we also know that schools will be closed at least until the end of the school year, pretty much from across the country. So difficult situation, but now that we know that school closures will be going on more than just a matter of weeks, but at least a matter of months, there's some tough decisions that educators and both teachers and administrators need to be making. So these slides are intended to give some recommendations specifically about grading, assessment, and feedback to help with those decisions. So to start, and by the way, the order in which I'm presenting, I think, is important. I present what I see as the most important first, and they will progressively become relatively less important. So a place to start for teachers, I believe, and teacher teams is establishing or reestablishing learning expectations. So I really suggest that teacher teams begin reevaluating their priority standards or learning targets as a learning team, collectively together. And by this, I mean the expectations of what students are to learn. Now, situations have changed, and we need to rethink what it is that we want students to be learning and need to be learning, and they can realistically be learning during this time. And a note here, I think it's really important for teachers and administrators to consider the fact that teachers have no obligation to stick to those unit maps that they've created either this past summer or in years past, because our situation has greatly changed since then. Nobody could have anticipated what has happened. And so because our situations have changed, our learning expectations and the needs of our students also have changed, and our learning expectations need to change along with that. So here are some questions that I suggest that teachers consider while they are re-evaluating their priority standards, their learning targets. And a note here, answers should be yes to each of these questions that they bring up when they're deciding whether or not a standard should stick around until at least the end of the school year. Question number 1, have students already learned at least part of the standard this year? It's important that the answer to this is yes, because of so much of learning now is put on the shoulders of the students themselves. And if they haven't learned at least part of it already, ideally they've learned all of it at least to a surface level, then this is going to be especially challenging for students to learn on their own. Question 2, are students mostly able to learn the standard on their own? So even if they've learned part of it before, we're expecting them to learn at least in more depth, right? So ideally, it's not something that's new, but it's something that they've learned at least a little bit, but to go further in depth. But if it's an especially challenging standard, we really want to think about, is it realistic for them to learn this on their own with the resources that we assume that they have? Third question, is the standard especially meaningful for their learning in the course this year? This is the time that we really need to scale back on a number of standards. And this is a conversation that seems like we're always having. We have too many standards. Well, now is the time to cut those standards if we haven't yet. Now, if ever, is the time. We need to cut back on these standards, so only the most important need to stay. And then lastly, is the standard especially meaningful for the learning next year? So now is the time to start thinking about next year if we haven't already. And obviously these school closures are going to have lots of implications in the years ahead. So we're probably talking about years for students to get caught up. So we want to make sure that students do have some of the most important standards that they are continuing to learn in the time that we have left in this school year. So along with making these decisions about these essential learning expectations, it's especially important to communicate those standards once they have been reestablished. So I think now more than ever, rubrics are really crucial to communicate. I know I find one of the most challenging aspects of teaching and distance learning with my students is that communication aspect. And rubrics, one of the key parts of rubrics is to communicate those learning expectations. So this is an example of an AP rhetorical analysis rubric that I have used in the past. I have used 4 different performance levels, and also there are 3 different standards that are on this rubric. So there are 3 criteria on the left. And each of these boxes has about a sentence that describes what I'm looking for. Now, I suggest that rubrics are used throughout the entire unit, not just at the end, not just something that is, well, in the past I would say that's stapled to an essay, but that won't be happening so much now. But we want to use it throughout so students can really learn along with it, and hopefully they will internalize these learning expectations. So things like norming, using exemplars to show different performance levels, really help to communicate that. And then students can ask questions throughout the unit as the unit progresses. So the second major consideration, at this time, is assessment. And so even though students are learning from home, it's still essential for teachers to be collecting evidence of students' learning of these reprioritized standards or learning targets. This evidence that is collected, it's really essential for the feedback that students need to continue learning. So here are a few recommendations about assessment. First of all, formative before summative. Assessment, all that is the collection of evidence of student learning and then making decisions, instructional decisions, and then also guidance to students in the form of feedback of how they can continue to improve. So formative assessment is something that we want to be going on continuously, and by doing that, teachers are just collecting evidence in many different ways. One of the issues I think lots of teachers may stumble across is what I say is over-formalizing the formative assessment process. That is, making a formative assessment into a huge event. It can be a somewhat large event, but it doesn't need to be. So formative assessment can be anything from individual assignments, quizzes, reflections, anything in which we collect evidence of their learning. Right? It could be a conversation that we have on Google Meet or on Zoom, and whatever way we can collect evidence. And we want to do this as often as possible. So summative assessment, it may be used still. So just because we're in distance learning doesn't mean summative assessment ends. We have to be very creative now in creation of summative assessments. But if teacher feels like students have come to the end of a learning progression and it's time to really get an understanding of where they are at, then summative assessment, that's what that is for. Importantly though, summative assessments, they really need to focus on assessing skills and not knowledge. Teachers need to assume that students, they have lots of knowledge available to them, not that they have to have it in order to do well on an assessment, but they're going to have resources such as the internet, possibly friends, family, so on and so forth. So we want to create authentic summative assessments when we do summatively assess, creative ways to assess students' learning. And I think one of the best ways to do that are for open-ended responses in writing. These are, of course, more challenging for teachers to assess, but it allows us to better authentically gauge students' learning and understanding. But also importantly, students should be given multiple opportunities to retake. Again, now more than ever, there are just too many possible reasonable explanations for students to not necessarily perform well the first time around. There are too many things going on in the world, potentially in students' lives, and we really need to give them the benefit of the doubt. Once we formatively assess, one of the key reasons that we do that is to get feedback. So another key part, essential part of the learning process is feedback. And now more than ever, we need to be giving lots of feedback because, again, communication is one of the most challenging parts, I think, of this distance learning process. So we want feedback early and often. So here are a few guiding ideas about feedback. As I'm teaching in my distance learning classes, I spend a majority of my time providing students with feedback on their learning process. And I'm trying to find better and faster ways through technology to do this. But again, I think it's very important as students continue to learn on their own. The feedback that we do give, really important that we align that to students' priority standards and learning targets, and rubrics really come into play again in this case. We want to be very specific. Vague feedback is not helpful feedback, but things that they can get a clear picture about where they're at and how they are going to get to that next performance level. As I've mentioned, formative assessment is the major way that we gather that evidence to provide feedback. And then hopefully students can also be assessing themselves. This is more challenging in distance learning than it is in traditional face-to-face learning. It's hard enough then, but hopefully they can be doing some of that so they can get an idea themselves about where they need to go. And finally, if students want to retake a summative assessment, that first planned summative assessment, that actually turns into a formative assessment when they decide that they need to retake. So what was planned as a summative turns into a formative if they're going to retake that because they didn't do well enough. And so very importantly, students need a lot of feedback from that first attempt to really practice further beyond that assessment event. But that's just a great opportunity to provide them some really good feedback to get them prepared and to get them up to where their learning really needs to be. And so they're more confident and they can just show what they're able to do in that retest. And so lastly, number 4 of these 4 different elements here is grading. And so notably, grading is not essential for learning, and we could do without it. Right? That's something that we need to start with, just to kind of clarify, because we can do without it. And I do get concerned when the first question that comes to teachers' minds is before they make any instructional decisions is how are they going to grade that? That's concerning because school is not about grades. School is about learning, and learning goes on without grades. So this should not be the first thing that we're thinking about, and how we move forward is going to be up to our different school districts most likely. Some districts have made decisions on how they're going to move forward grading, some haven't. And so some teachers may be asked to grade. In the traditional A through F, others are going credit, no credit, or pass or fail, or pass and complete, and some other varieties in between there. So more than anything, here's just a little bit of guidance about if you are grading, whether it's traditional or a new form of grading, we want to make sure that the grade represents students' learning and their learning of those prioritized standards. Right? We want grades to be equitable. Equity, again, now than ever, more than ever, needs to be in our minds. We want to make sure grades represent student learning. So here are just a few recommendations. Number 1, don't grade practice, whether we call it classwork or homework or whatever we want to call it. We don't want to grade practice. Again, students are at home. There are just way too many understandable reasons where students couldn't possibly complete the practice, or they possibly couldn't complete it as well as possible in ideal situations. And we need to give students the benefit of the doubt. So when we're grading practice, we're also grading, their home life and so on and so forth. So it's just too much of an equity issue, and there's just too much of a disparity in students' learning resources. So we should not grade practice. I don't recommend ever grading practice, but especially now. And in addition to that, just because a student has completed work, that doesn't mean that they've learned something. And we all know this, right? We know just because a student finishes homework, they didn't necessarily learn that. And now. There's just too easy to have access to internet or parents' help or friends or so on and so forth. So just because it's done doesn't mean they've learned it. And so that's an inaccuracy issue. And so teachers oftentimes they wonder, well, why should a student do it if it's not graded? Well, students will probably surprise you that they will do homework. They will do practice when they see that it's meaningful, when they see that it helps them to learn those learning expectations, those learning standards. When they see that it will help them to be successful on summative assessments, they will do that. That's something that I've really found this year especially is I do not grade any homework. My grades in my before school closures were created 100% from summative assessment. My grades right now are kind of in limbo as I'm thinking about how I'm going to create grades, and as I'm waiting for some specific guidance from my school district. So some things to think about in grading. Ideally, again, keep in mind equity first. Also, we want grades to accurately represent what students have learned. So just a couple last thoughts about grading and some recommendations. If you do grade, make them from summative assessments only, and summative assessments that only are on repeat standards, right? So this way, if we're only assessing on those repeat standards, then students already have taken a test on this. All we're trying to do is a more updated look, and hopefully kids have been able to learn in greater depth. But even if a student doesn't complete an assessment, then if you do grade in this way, and you do assess in this way, well, we can just fall back on the previous evidence of learning that we have from the student, right? Because if we're just saying, well, this is what they knew before school closures, but I don't have evidence right now, it is not accurate to give a student a 0 in this kind of a case, right? And that is not a kind-hearted thing to do either. So we can fall back on that previous evidence, again, because we're using mostly standards that are repeat standards, but we just want them to go into greater depth. So again, we want to keep an open mind about students' situations that they're potentially going through. So some final thoughts here. More than anything, use professional judgment when making these pedagogical decisions. Use your expertise, but make team decisions. Make team decisions because you have the expertise of multiple people, right? Multiple years, many, many years of experience usually, and just this the opportunity to share these thoughts together in teams can usually result in really fair decisions and strong decisions. We want to prioritize equity as well, again, especially in the context of our current situation. And we want to strive for a balance between learning, grace, and understanding. This has been the GAF podcast, where I discuss grading, assessment, and feedback in secondary schools. Thank you for listening.